Hi, my name is Rachel Saunders. Welcome to the Temporal Hospitality podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and follow the links in the description to see the script. 80 years ago this August, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated by 2 atomic bombs. Over the course of 2023 and 2024, Ukrainian cities have been reduced piecemeal to rubble, countless lives lost amidst the carnage. Before the world's cameras, Israeli defense forces have systematically leveled Gaza, turning homes into tombs. History is littered with the annihilation of cities, whole populations being put to the sword, and in this I explore the historiography of such warfare, the effects it has on the populations, and why we choose to condemn some and collectively turn away from others. To paraphrase MASH, war is war and hell is hell, because only those worthy go to hell. War carries with it the innocent and the guilty, with many more left behind to pay the butcher's bill. Urban destruction goes back to the first cities, with Babylonian and Assyrian records conveying the brutality sacking a city wrought on civilians. There is a direct thread between the IDF and Ashurbanipal, except modern armies are supposed to abide by the Geneva Convention and not blindly follow orders. War is never a moral or righteous act. It is sometimes necessary to prevent a greater evil. Yet, the reality is that all war induces unimaginable suffering on all parties involved. Being anti-war and desiring peace does not make you a coward or weak. As the litany of slaughter across human history shows, it is not civilians and citizens who benefit from war. It is always those who sit above the fray, sending people to their death. The concept of total war is perceived as a modern one, but the sacking of cities, destruction of baggage trains, and enslavement of defeated people ever since show that our modern understanding is a projection onto the past. Tanks, planes, guns, and militaria have a certain cachet, which I can appreciate, but ultimately, when turned on the vulnerable and innocent, simply to progress a cause, is that cachet worth it? Every urban conflict and obliteration of cities has carried with it a high cost, both in terms of lives and material. Soldiers are forever scarred in the conducting of urban operations, while civilians caught in the crossfire can only hope that the laws of war are respected. It is easy to glorify victories in abstract, such as the Allies' defeat of the Germans in the Normandy campaign. Yet, when you look closer at all wars, invariably a tale of death and destruction follows. Accounting for the life stories of civilians expands our understanding of war, putting ordinary people back into the well-known narratives of urban warfare. This brings a reverse angle which illuminates the human dimension of war, revealing both the prolonged suffering and surprise happiness found in strife and turmoil. However, this is not to imply that the study of war or the acknowledgement of victory is an unworthy endeavour. For war to have any sense of meaning, we always produce narratives to justify our actions. Hence, why the destruction of German and Japanese cities is barely a footnote compared to the atomic bombs. This is only just hyperbole, because as TV shows such as Band of Brothers and Masters of the Air demonstrate, when war comes down to the human level, the levelling of cities using firebombs looks a lot less heroic than the struggles of individual aircrew being shot down by Messerschmitts and flak. This is the problem with historic grand narratives, something which the 2024 Gaza campaign by the IDF has inverted because individual Gazans are being broadcast around the world, with drone shots of destroyed streets lingering for effect. This then is a dive into the cost of total war, and how what we perceive to be an artefact of modern industrial processes has a long, tortured history. My focus is on large urban centres, for while armies have historically decimated rural hinterlands on their manoeuvres, the threat that ties Gaza to Jericho is one of deliberate mass destruction and slaughter by an opposing armed force that razed the city to the ground or left its inhabitants dead. Ethics of war and suffering. A central conceit for all analysis of war is a basic moral virtue of war as a social construct. Pacifism rejects war as a means through which to achieve a moral objective. Indeed, for the most part of modern societies, reject violence as a means to achieve any ends. Societies reject murder, assault, and general use of violence by anyone other than the state, except in circumscribed situations. The historic trend has been to eliminate state use of violence, such as executions and torture, as these are viewed as increasingly barbaric. Yet, when it comes to the application of violence in war, the moral framing of state violence is rarely questioned. Karl von Clausewitz proposed in On War that war is politics by other means, an understanding of war waged by rulers who rarely had to answer to the men they sent into combat, and civilians impacted by that warfare. Up until the American Civil War, civilian narratives of war were limited to diaries and novels, with little to no immediate news reporting on how civilians were treated. Sherman's March to the Sea and its total warfare on Georgia made strategic sense, but its moral cost has been used as a justification for rejecting the Union's waging of a just war. The same is true for the demolition of Grozny by the Russians in both Chechen wars, the butcher's bill far in excess of what could be morally justified. The Clausewitzian approach to war was demolished after the Great War and finally deemed illegitimate in the post-World War II consensus. Yet, the destruction of urban centres continues to this day for many reasons, the primary one being to break the will of those who dwell within. Gaza and Ukrainian cities are targeted in part to terrorise civilians with the fear of unknown death, with civilian infrastructure declared open season to cow the populace. Ethically, this is unconscionable, yet no outside force is taking to the skies to enforce a no-fly zone, like the Allies did after the First Gulf War when Saddam Hussein was destroying Kurdish towns in northern Iraq. Moral responsibility lies with us all. Shami Chakrabarti suggests that human rights provide the poetry of the cries for freedom and pleas for protection, necessarily in a world ravaged by war, oppression, and inequality. Human rights were born out of the understanding that war should not be used to abuse and dehumanize, that belligerents can commit total war and expect not to face legal consequences. As Article 4 of the 1949 Geneva Convention states, nationals of a state which is not bound by the Convention are not protected by it. Nationals of a neutral state which find themselves in the territory of a belligerent state, and nationals of a co-belligerent state, shall not be regarded as protected persons while the state of which they are nationals has normal diplomatic representations in the state in whose hands they are. This means that civilians caught in armed conflicts are at the mercy of their government having signed the Geneva Convention, and the belligerent parties respecting civilian lives. While the spirit of this article has been propagated since the First Geneva Convention in 1864, it was initially aimed at protecting armed combatants. This is why it is important to engage in the moral and ethical history of violence against civilians, especially the destruction of cities, as it shows how attitudes have shifted over the last 160 years. The question therefore needs to be asked: how much we as a society are prepared to morally and ethically accept with respect to civilians in warfare. In 2025, the Israeli war against Hamas has devastated Gaza, bringing global protests out onto the street in attempts to stop the war and hold Israel to account. Morally, people have decided to take pro or anti-Israel stances, with the war crimes charged against both Hamas and Israel showing that the legal ethics are complex. Globally in 2025, Myanmar, Sudan, Ukraine and the Democratic Republic of Congo have all suffered urban combat which has devastated civilian targets, yet these have not attracted the same ethical concerns. This may be a case of compassion fatigue, or, more prosaically, those narratives have not attracted as much opprobrium and social media traction. Jarausch suggests that sustained looks at unexceptional lives dissolves grand narratives and propaganda, allows us to reveal the impact of political conflicts on shattered lives. The media narrative surrounding Ukraine and Gaza focus on civilians caught up in those conflicts because the media understands that this is a way to make audiences care. Other global conflicts rarely get this level of coverage, meaning that while brutal and total war is being inflicted on civilians, the coverage is lacking. I would suggest that this is why we need to be careful when engaging with narratives surrounding total war and civilian deaths. Questions of righteous wars such as World War II overlook the suffering and devastation inflicted on civilians on all sides. Masters of the Air did an interesting parts 5 and 6 showing the German hostility to the American aircrew who bombed their cities, a rare example of German suffering and behaviour from the war. Blitz, another Apple film, shows the harrowing impact of total war on London, though frames it through a familial lens rather than drawing out the broader impact. Narratives of suffering matter, which in turn frames how we ethically and morally frame civilian suffering during hostilities. Myths, legends, and the first cities. Jericho and Troy stand as artifacts of a deep time in human history. Both cities exist, and both have had extensive excavations done to see if their fictive narratives hold a semblance of truth. As with all myths, there is likely a grain of truth in the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Book of Joshua. What those narratives tell us is that human history seems to have had a penchant for sacking cities and laying waste to their inhabitants. Neither Homer nor the author of Joshua condemn these sackings. Indeed, they are justified by the gods against cities which have sinned. Are these the justifications for just war? That the gods willed it, so therefore who are we to deny them? Such a refrain is seen time and time again across the pre-Roman world. Yet, it is a bit more complicated than that. That the wall of Jericho fell down flat. Then the Israelites went into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both men and women, young and old, ox and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Only Rahab the harlot and her family were spared. They burned the city and all that was in it. Chapter 6 of the Book of Joshua. This is taught in Christian churches as a virtuous moral act by the Israelites against the heathen Canaanites, with the Bible clear that no mercy or compassion was or ought to be shown towards them. Civilian suffering has no framing in the Christian Bible, especially in the conquest littered throughout the Old Testament. Even Christ's new commandment of loving your neighbour is tempered with the understanding that no prior commandment is undone. Doctrinally, this sets up a problematic framing of civilian welfare, though, as the establishment of the Red Cross highlights, what is doctrine and what is applied are two separate, evolving concepts. Homer's Odyssey is more circumspect with civilian deaths, with Odysseus weeping as he describes what he did in Troy. It highlights the cultural approaches to civilians in Homeric Greece and modern mores, yet the reality was that Greek attitudes to warfare were both brutal and used to enslave populations. Homer's allegory in the Odyssey served the purpose of teaching the relation between humanity and the gods, with slaughter seen as part of the nature of war. The mythologizing of Jericho and Troy demonstrate the need to justify the violence meted out to cities and civilian populations, with much the same narratives used to justify the bombing of German cities during the Second World War. This is seen in the post-war apathy towards bomber command, yet films such as The Dam Busters explicitly leave out the mass casualties caused by the flooding in the Ruhr. Guy Gibson and 617 Squadron have become the new Jason and the Argonauts. Gibson himself, an Odyssean figure, turned more into myth than man. It is not disrespectful to the Allies' legacy to say modern audiences prefer the allegory of the good Allies compared to the messy realities of slaughter they inflicted on cities such as Hamburg, Dresden and Tokyo. Salting the ground. Dresden and Hamburg were rebuilt, their populations recovering post-war. Troy and Jericho were razed to the ground, forever ruins, at least in the myth. This idea of salting the ground is rooted in history, with the Roman sack and destruction of Carthage as Exhibit A of historic eradication of culture, cities and civilizations. As Francis Kelsey outlines, Carthaginian Carthage was only the first phase of civilization on the site, as the Punic city was followed by Romans, Vandals and Byzantines until its final abandonment in 698 AD. It was Muslim conquest of North Africa that finally put pay to Carthage as a city. William Fitzgerald in 1819 imagined the Roman sacking of the city from the Punic perspective, having Carthaginian Octavius state, "The Romans raising our defensive mark, the city shrieking a terrible fate, death and ravaging slaughter for our streets." He wrote this in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. Carthage is much allegory about the destruction of a civilization by a conquering general, the Roman Scipio, as Napoleon was to the destroyed cities of Europe during his military campaigns during the preceding 20 years. Tiepolo's The Capture of Carthage, painted between 1725 and 29, also drew on contemporary history within the allegory, this time the battles between Venice and the Ottoman Empire. Turner, like Fitzgerald, drew on Napoleonic politics when he painted the decline of the Carthaginian Empire in 1817, which his audience would have understood as reflecting contemporary politics. All three pieces of art demonstrate the power of the fall of Carthage reflected through the prism of their own times. In a refrain drawing in the earlier history of Troy, Polybius wrote, "Scipio, the Roman general who destroyed Carthage, when he looked upon the city as it was utterly perishing, and in the last throes of its complete destruction, is said to have shed tears and wept openly for his enemies, after being wrapped in thought for long, and realizing that all cities, nations, and authorities must, like men, meet their doom. That this happened to Ilium, once a prosperous city, to the empires of Assyria, Media, and Persia, the greatest of their time, and to Macedonia itself, the brilliance of which was so recent, either deliberately or the verses escaping him, he said, 'A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people will be slain.' Like Odysseus, Scipio is portrayed as caring for the people his soldiers are butchering, a moral man who was only doing what needed to be done. Polybius, a Roman historian, makes no mention of Carthaginian suffering, and even 18th and 19th century creators downplay the brutality of the Roman conquest and sacking of the city. Ben Kiernan suggests the sack of Carthage may have been the first recorded genocide. He reckons between a third and half of the population were killed, though he makes the category of trying to impose a modern understanding of genocide onto the Punic Wars. Carthage was not the first genocide. The Assyrians and Babylonians committed wholesale mass slaughters as they sacked and razed cities 700 years earlier, and there is a critical need to not project modern understanding onto the past. Herein lies the issue with using myth and early historiographies to gain an understanding of war and the human condition. Every source we have from the Punic Wars is propaganda from either side, which, given the Romans eventually wiped Carthage off the map, means we have primarily their narratives to fit the pieces together. Paintings, plays, and history books reflect our understanding of ourselves as much as it does the period. So when we write about Roman total war, it is a reflection of ourselves as much as it is them. By eliminating the civilians from the narratives, we make the Punic Wars more palatable, more digestible. Thus, in the erasure of the viscera, we are essentially Lancaster bombers dropping our payloads without hearing the screams of the dying below. This is true for much of recorded history, the sanitized version being the only version we have access to. The cost of total war. On the 18th of February 1943, Joseph Goebbels stood before a vast audience, exhorting the German people to commit to total war, arguing for greater sacrifice for the good of the war effort. Germany only ramped up its war production after 1941 as the war dragged on, And by 1943, the losses in Russia and North Africa were turning the war against the Third Reich. The narrative was beginning to harden as the National Socialists carried out their genocidal actions with the implicit and explicit knowledge of the German nation. Modern conceptions of Germany are forever tainted by those atrocities and war crimes, yet this does not mean the German population did not suffer. Torsten Wiehiler outlines how Germans feel about the war. For understandable reasons, Germans tend to commemorate the war in a very sombre fashion. There are documentaries and memorial ceremonies for the dead, but the general approach is very much focused on the facts of what happened and not on the personal experiences and sacrifices of the German soldiers involved. Interestingly, Germany seems to identify more with Allied soldiers, mainly because 95% of movies and documentaries on the subject are of Anglo-American import and obviously tend to portray the events on their sides. For civilians it was worse. Beneath the veneer of post-war recovery, almost every family in Germany had tales of lives disrupted or lost, drawing out the devastating impact of total war and the Third Reich. You see this in stories of Ukrainian refugees who fled the war zone at the beginning of 2023, with renewed fear that countries like America will upend their lives based on geopolitics. As Manvi Singh highlights, those seeking to get justice for the victims of the Gaza campaign are being targeted by the US government in an unprecedented manner, the human tragedies of the war being silenced for the sake of politics. When people such as Ramiesa Ozturk are arrested for protesting war, then we are entering a new dark age when the suffering of innocence is a price worth paying for those in power. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum stands as testimony to the atrocities of war, and that the price paid by 100,000 Hiroshimans was worth paying to bring an end to war. Yet, in Grozny, Aleppo, Gaza, Mariupol, and any number of cities since 1945, and the suffering of those civilians will tell you, we have failed to learn the lessons over and over again. 20 days in Mariupol renders down war to its bitterest seed, showing the barbarity and futility of war. Unlike Carthage, we can all face destruction square in the eye and see it for the slaughter it is. War is war, and hell is hell, because war is indiscriminate, and we should all be Odysseus and Scipio in the face of such brutality. The cost of total war is not just the lives lost and the cities sundered, it is the corrosive power war evokes in us, the acceptance that it can be just and occasionally noble, not something that can be an absolute last resort when all else fails. The moment you accept that 180,000 must die so that war can come to an end is the moment you realise that the cost of total war is not worth the butcher's bill. No war ever is.